Thank you so much. Maybe before we start, there are a couple of things that we would like to share. One is that we are going to be reading our paper. Sylvia and I are very good at improvising and speaking to each other's ideas and interrupting each other. But we are not doing that today. And also, I just want to say that the work that we are sharing is a work that started 13 or more years ago at Capilano University. Even if I am today at York University, this is a work that speaks to that and continue speaking, of course, to the work that we are doing. We are very grateful for this opportunity to contribute to the dialogues that the center has organized. We are particularly thankful to Professor Park and Schulte, not only for this invitation, but also for their generative and provoking scholarship. I also want to acknowledge that Sylvia and I are joining you, respectively, from the lands of Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Cowichan people. We walk these lands as settlers, and as such, we are committed to learn to listen to the people of these lands and to respond to the call to act to unsettle colonial legacies in education. Our talk today will have three parts. First, we would like to start by briefly positioning ourselves as artillerista and pedagogista. Then we will present 4 brief speculations on how our work intersects and the ways we have been trying to articulate our messy, difficult, and at the same time stimulating and delightful collaborative work. And I'm referring to them as speculations because really Sylvia and I have been trying to think and articulate more what is it that has happened at the intersection of pedagogy and the arts, pedagogista, artillerista work only in the last few years. We have been for years just deeply immersed in the work. Yes, and then Sylvia will follow this by taking up these speculations, but as always in divergence and not just repeating or almost echoing. And the work that the paper will show is very much how we enact this intersection between pedagogista and artillerista. So starting with me and positioning myself a little bit, I am a pedagogista within the Italian tradition. This means that pedagogy is my field of study. In fact, as you may know, in Italy, pedagogy is a social science. A pedagogista thinks education and engages with education as a project and also as a question. At the same time, my thinking has been profoundly influenced by curriculum theory in Canada since the first day I encountered it during my doctoral studies. My concerns in education emerge and are deeply entangled with all the geographies that are tattooed in my heart, with their histories and their people. And Sylvia?
In this Canadian context, an artillerista is a role that's been adapted from the approaches of the pre-primary schools in Reggio Emilia, Italy. And I come to this as an artist, significantly influenced by artography and forms of research creation, particularly as they relate to the visual arts and art practice as research, where knowing, being, and making are rhizomatically intertwined. And I'll say more about this later.
So now we are going to move into these brief speculations. We are working with 4 main speculations. The first one, we activate what happens in the present as we catch the world on the move. Although we come from different points of view, we both attend to and engage with the conditions in which our current times and cultural objects are produced. We both are interested in the relational forms that are available, not so that we can reproduce what is already given, as it seems to be the role of education today, and not to propose some transcendental change either, like a kind of a utopic reality. We are interested in the present and in education as the space to stitch or insert a proposition, an alternative possibility as we catch the world on the move, as Deleuze will say, as we are in the midst of it. This attention to inserting a proposition or creating a flickering, as Masumi calls it, into the present is why we have insisted on composing and curating situations that activate particular experiences. And this idea of curating and composing particular experiences is very dear to us. So we hope that through the conversation today will really be visible. The transformational spirit of the arts and pedagogy inspires our practices. Our interest in early childhood education has never been about it being a field for socializing children. Rather, our work is an ethical and political commitment to weakening the taken for granted neoliberal and managerial logics that characterize education. Our work has also troubled the idea that education is to be equated with teaching and learning, or what Diviesta refers as the learnification of education. We are interested in education as a cultural production, one that not only reproduces normalized realities, but also can create and propose new symbols and other forms of relating and being. Here I am referring to logics that are less extractive and assimilative, less efficient and accumulative, less individualistic and fragmentary. This is why at the intersection of our practices, we ask and have been asking for a long time, what does it do to activate experiences and processes of creating and becoming at the intersection of pedagogy and the arts? This is really a dear question to us. Both pedagogy and the arts are interested in creating an experience. The idea of activating a field of experience has guided many of our encounters with the students and educators. What we mean by this is that rather than instrumentalizing pedagogy and the arts as sites to prepare students to achieve better, more authentic relations with children, our interest has focused on animating the question I just asked. In other words, activating experiences and processes of creating and becoming that happen at the intersection of pedagogy and the arts. Now I'm going to move to speculation number 2. An atelierista or pedagogista works at the site of divergence. And here we are borrowing this concept from Isabel Stenger's. And also our relation is always and always has been characterized by a partial connection. And here I am borrowing from Marilyn Strathern's work. Our work is a mutual nourishment that emerges from dialogues that do not require sameness. The relation among our practices is characterized by divergence and partial connections. By this, we mean an encounter of practices that exceed the encounter in divergence. In other words, the encounter generates something else. It creates a displacement in thought. The very encounter changes and regenerates the practices. Learning to live and work in this way has been difficult on many levels. It has taught us to embrace and cultivate what we call corresponding improvisations, and to notice how such corresponding acts produce novel threads with which, together with children and educators, we stitch something into the present. And in doing so, we inhabit stories that are in the making. These stories matter, as our pedagogista-atelierista connections are not a free-for-all. They have always been in the name of creating something beyond ourselves. And perhaps this concept of creating something beyond of ourselves has been one of the hardest concepts to work with and through among students and educators. Although we both think about processes that activate and formalize subjective and collective experiences, we think about these processes in very different ways. For me, questions very often are concerned with what is taking form. What form producing worlds are we reproducing? How are they nourished? To what do they respond? And what are or should be their languages? With what might it correspond? And what are its effects and affects? For Sylvia, questions that guide her are about artistic experimentation, collective improvisational processes, how materials propose particular ways of thinking, and what processes emerge from such experimentations. We have had to learn how to compose with each other's thinking. Over the years, this intersection has become a site for fertile and complicated encounters that have pushed faculty, early childhood educators, and future educators to think beyond conventional and established ways in early childhood studies. This work is often met with resistance and outright rejection because it is not easy to engage with what destabilizes what is seen as conventional and common. This dynamic between resistance, inspiration, and provocation has been particularly present in our work with future early childhood educators. And for Sylvia and for me, it's very important to share this with you, that this has been quite a heavy and difficult work. And even finding our ways, not as scholars or as pedagogists at the just as Sylvia and Cristina, and figuring out how to work together has been always an interesting and difficult and joyful process. So now I'm going to share our third speculation. Curriculum making is ideation. That is, we make situations. We intersect our practices in the making of curriculum. We do this driven by the conviction that one doesn't go through education, but one lives it. It makes us. And this idea of just going through education is an idea that worries us. In curriculum making, our intersecting practices ideate situations that take up a life, a collective life. This is why, for both of us, it deeply matters what kind of experiences and living conditions are being supported. Taking up a life means engaging with the aporetic situations that are at the heart of learning to live with others. It also means figuring out what is it to live. And I think that is the process that we are in, deeply immersed, I think all of us. We create these situations through the speculative force afforded by the divergence of our symbiotic practices. Over the years, we have learned to welcome its incongruous discomfort. Ideation is the mode of our encounter as we have sought to create pedagogical and artistic situational conditions that introduce what Fanon referred to as the invention into life. Invention into life. And here I have to say that in the work that we have done with Sylvia, we have been very influenced by the situationists, and that is a whole other conversation, but I always like to mention how contaminated we are by their work. In the curricular situations and happenings we create, Sylvia, the children, educators, students, and I are at the same time hosts and guests of what we create. Following Derrida, I will say this double dynamic exceeds the logic of teaching, learning, student teacher, if you want practicum, student mentor, provider, user. We are hosts and guests of a collection of situations that are nourished day after day, gesture after gesture, project after project, through the layering of stories and the production of artifacts. And as we are welcome to it, we become of it. This is why we refer to our work as inciting an ethos, and the multiple symbolic artifacts that emerge from it and create a history. As an atelierista and pedagogista, we are interested in different ways about the symbolic value of the worlds we create, their forming and deforming. And the last speculation, we incite the potential of pedagogy and the arts to redistribute the sensible. Finally, our modes of thinking and practice intersect to create processes that might redistribute the sensible, as Rancière invites us to consider. This is where our work is not only pedagogical and aesthetic, but also ethical and political. There has been a mutual complicity to interrupt the take it for granted early childhood order through minute, mundane, everyday gestures and situations that experiment with deforming and reconfiguring the available cultural grammars. And by doing so, inviting other sensibilities, encountering unexpected ones, being undone by the force of the structural order, and yet, despite that, creating threads for new social fabrications. This is why in our work with educators and students, we often ask, how do we create spaces that enable us to co-constitute becomings? What relations are we subtracting from? What relations can we sustain? And so with this, we have shared these speculations about our intersecting work. And now Sylvia will follow, taking them up in this kind of divergence and see where it takes us. And then we will just wrap up with some thoughts at the end.
Right, thank you, Cristina. So in taking up Cristina's speculations, it is necessary to move away from perceiving creativity and artistry as primarily an individual and inner quality, and the individual at the center or even primary instigator of artistic and pedagogical practice, and something other than sensory experience, free flow, or early childhood education as primarily following the child, as can be so common in early childhood art practices once we leave behind the idea of teacher as instructor of skills or provider of information. And instead, we consider art as event, taking shape within an intersection of forces, materials, bodies, ideas, and processes. In resonance with Conturi, this considers that art is always in process and in perpetual movement, taking shape, as Marshall and Adamo describe, within a multiplicity of relationships in constant flux at the intersection of thought and action. Even in its forms and figurations, nothing is static. And through its processes and practices, we enter into thinking in motion. Whoops, I meant to put that there. In considering this, I will draw on instances where children ages 1 to 5 and educators from the Campus Children's Center and early childhood education students are in this together. Since we are all in processes, as Rita Irwin and Carl Lego describe in their work in artography, of becoming pedagogical and growing in artistry together, when I only mention educators, I am also including early childhood education students in this. Illustrated in the instances and images that accompany this presentation are moments from early childhood education studio and curriculum courses and studio events with the Children's Center. Each reflects an effort to bring educators and children together in sites of co-composition. A significant aspect of my work has been to instigate artistic events and bring artistic perspective and artistic ways of knowing in intersection with pedagogy, while creating conditions and designing situations for in-depth curriculum inquiries and projects with children and educators in the Campus Children's Center and Early Childhood Education program. When I refer to the studio, I am referring to these intersections, situations, and events, not specifically a place or a room, but these events. So I think of the studio as an event, as an intersection, not a place. While I discuss aspects of these studio events, Cristina's speculations and her pedagogical provokings to attend to the formations of things are woven throughout and continue to echo in the encounters, and is my constant companion. If I always tell Cristina, had I been left to myself, I would have just been doing more and more and more experimentations, opening things up. Her provocations has always been to what is taking form. I can never get away from that. The connections between our work and our ways have not been direct or linear, often as interferences, disturbances, provocations that linger and displace. We have shared a common vision, but haven't followed parallel pathways. This intersection of atelierista and pedagogista has been immensely fertile. In these studio gatherings, we compose spaces and situations as intersectional events of mutual composition and collective improvisation, creating conditions where we are immersed in the flow of things, where, as Cristina discussed, we catch the world on the move, so that what is being formed is not only of our own making or the result of human intentionality. For instance, here at the river, we encounter the clay as it interacts, alters, mutates, and joins with the flow of the water. Children and educators moving and composing with each other and with the river and with the clay in transformation, where there is something other than our own artistic intentions to attend to, and we are caught in the currents of the world. In this way, again, in Cristina's words, always in my mind, we are called into something bigger than ourselves, and we participate with a world in flux and in movement. This situates us within an ecology of practice, and what takes shape is a living network of relations and choreography of practice, where we are collectively immersed in situations that enable co-constituting becomings. Improvisation is the energy that fuels this. Borrowing then from Ingold and Hallam, we consider creative acts as processes of social and collective improvisation, of human and more than human intersections and collaborations. To give insight into this, Ingold and Hallam use the illustration of how someone might make their way down a busy street, always improvising in response to others, to the ebb and flow of bodies, to the ground, to the obstacles one encounters, so that it is a process of constant responsive movements and adjustments. Ingold writes, walking calls for the pedestrian's continual responsiveness to the terrain, the paths, and the elements. To respond, we must attend to things as we go along, joining or participating with them in our own movements. In this way, improvisation is responsive attunement to what is going on, thinking in movement, in concert and in correspondence to what is unfolding. This is intimately related to Manning and Masumi's thinking doing, in which thought is activated in and through creative practice, not enacting already planned events or applying predetermined orientations, but emergent in dialogic encounters. As Cristina described, encounter as a displacement in thought, where we are called into being in these encounters. We think of this kind of improvisational attention and attunement as a sensitive reciprocity, a symbiotic orchestration or movement with, rather than knowledge about someone or something. To attune to something is to pay close attention, to orient towards it, to find a rhythm and a synchronicity with it. Ingold describes this as an event of corresponding with, a process not seeking to describe, represent, or gather more information about the world, about children, about flight here, about teaching, but to open up to what is going on so we in turn can respond to it. It is engaging with the world always in the making and in its relational becoming. This then is much more than an individual's pursuit and situates teacher education as a symbiotic project, always in formation. It requires of students and ourselves active and experimental engagement, continual improvisational adjustments and responsiveness, while staying open to changing conditions as we follow along the paths that open up, responding in and through a field of relations. This necessitates what Manning and Masumi describe as enabling constraints. We think of this as intentionally curating and putting into play things to encounter, to work with and against, to respond to and improvise with, creating situations where improvisation is necessary to find one's way. As Ingold and Hallam describe, the outcome depends at every moment on the exercise of care, judgment, and dexterity. This is contingent on risk rather than certainty, as there is always the risk that things can take an unanticipated direction. The work in this way is intensely experimental, where doubts, impasses, troubles are cast as generative gestures so that we are always at the edge of productivity and collapse. We designed situations to provoke an element of difficulty and to engage ourselves in this, where I am unsettled and destabilized as well, and need to figure out a way through along with what is going on. This is essential, as Biesta discusses, in resisting the desire to make education strong, secure, and predictable. And so I intentionally curate the studio, a site for children, educators, and students together, so that material elements play together and act on and with each other and have an interactive aliveness even before children and educators enter the space. A space that is collectively made and composed through mutual action that transforms and is transformed. Curating a space means we're not just thinking about human interactions, instrumental purposes, or the activity provided, but considers the life, relations, characteristics, and movements of materials. This instigates a processual curriculum of being, becoming, and co-composing as we aim to create a collective and intraactive life together. In this, we consider the materials' potentialities and how the materials and processes enable particular ways of being and thinking together. Fabric in particular assists us with this, as it lends itself to fluid, sensational, textural, temporal, and interconnected ways of knowing and being. So long lengths of airy, iridescent fabric fill the studio, each piece enveloping and entangling others, as each length is more than one child can easily work with. The flight-like, ephemeral, transitory, and fluid nature of this fabric resonates with moving bodies, the moving air, the fluidity and transformability of ideas and emerging compositions. Bodies and fabric are in intimate relation, and there are textural resonances between the touch of fabric and who one might become. The fabric is wrapped around a child and becomes wings. Then dropped to the ground, it becomes formless again, waiting to be taken up and reconfigured in other ways. The material itself is always in movement, floating, shifting, changing, wrapping, covering, and entangling. And as Manning writes, it resists formation long enough for us to see the potential worlds in the making. And so together in the studio and in these events, with educators, we consider acts of adapting, improvising, responding, moving with materials, children, and others, so that curriculum and experience making becomes a symbiotic process and an improvisational journey of moving with each other and with the propositions we surround ourselves with, as well as what these propositions produce. Similar to Conturi, we think of these collaborations as ecologies of participation that are embodied, relational, enactive, performative, and material. In the creation of an experience and in proposing processes that create transformation, it becomes events of learning to move, correspond with, respond to, and work with each other, with materials and processes, and with the forces at play. We create immersive spaces and situations where these correspondences are made visible and material, where we inhabit the drawings, become the drawing, and are implicated in the marks, movements, and in the pace and pulse and evolutions of drawing. We deliberately select the materials we will be working with, not making decisions based on what we can do, make, or produce with a material, but on what materials can do with us and to us. For instance, in nurturing dispositions and attunements that unsettle neoliberal individualistic demands for immediacy and mastery, again, one of Cristina's insistences, we select charcoal as the medium of inquiry, as it poses particular possibilities, difficulties, and interferences. Charcoal marks us, and we are never separate from what emerges. Charcoal lends itself to strong and distinctive lines, dramatic markings, rich, deep, and immersive blackness, multiple tonalities of grays, and is unique in the way it draws our attention to the spectacle of mark making. Charcoal also has spreading, velvety, and diffuse qualities. It has a unique flexibility and instability. It is easy to alter and erase, and has qualities of both permanence and impermanence. Hard and soft, fluid and definite, it offers many variances and contradictions. It moves easily between bodies and surfaces, making it difficult to contain. It is nearly impossible to get away from it when it is welcomed as a presence in the room. It marks bodies, surfaces, clothings, doorways, and furniture, and leaves traces throughout the space, producing resistances and disturbances, as well as unique generativities. The markings refuse to stay confined on the paper, and thus lend themselves to social and relational movements and configurations, supporting us in thinking about drawing and mark making as a collective and improvisational event rather than individual endeavor. We arrange spaces to welcome and be hospitable to the charcoal and to its spreading and diffuse qualities and to the difficulties we hope that it initiates. We emphasize ways of moving together, of attending to, and responding to the tempos, rhythms, comings and goings, qualities of marks made and lines drawn, and intervals of action and pauses. Sustaining attention, not planning or deciding in advance what will take place, but engaging in a responsive and continuous, as Ingold would describe, intuition in action. We try to move with each other's emerging imagery, mark making and experimentation, aware that this will be full of difficulty. We are pressed on one hand with the desire to respond to young children's experimentations and to honor their approaches and improvisations, and at the same time in ethical tension not to overtake or direct the events, nor to remain passive, as if we are just observers and facilitators. We aim to attend to the charcoal as an active participant in the making of an ethos, one of Christina's central concerns, by responding to and following its lures, invitations, variances, movements, and provocations. We attune to what comes of this, to the laughter that erupts, the rhythmic tapping and sonorities of charcoal dancing and sliding on the paper, songs and melodies that emerge in response, children joining in the dance in a variety of ways. We attend to their desire to inhabit the processual movements and evolutions. The invitation for educators to join in these material dialogues and encounters is a delicate thing and requires increasing pedagogical and artistic attunement, often asking more than we are capable of in the moment, yet offering vibrant openings for thinking otherwise, for resisting instrumentalities, and also the romantic self-expressive child, and cultivating other response abilities. It is essentially not about learning, meaning making, the production of particular works or processes, but envisioning other ways of being together. In this, there is the constant echo of Christina's provocations, and there is resistance to instrumentalizing pedagogy and the arts as sites to prepare students to achieve better and more authentic relations with children. Rather, our interest has focused on the question of what might it do to animate experiences and processes of creating and becoming, so that we don't just go through education, as Cristina mentioned, but attend to how it might be lived. As O'Donoghue writes, it is a turn to what art does best. That is, it restores the world to us as an experience to be lived. So it isn't just a production of an experience or any experience, but again, as O'Donoghue describes, one is made different or becomes other than what one was prior to participation. This requires full presence and attentive participation. To be drawn in means developing sensitivities to the rhythms and tempos of charcoal, marks, and bodies, most of this taking shape in small moments of reciprocity and exchange. In this instance, a child begins to mark the white surface with thick sticks of charcoal. She draws a single line, and as she draws her hand back, an educator echoes her lines. A rhythm emerges, a line for line, a mark for mark, each mark in resonance with the one before and in response to the tempo of mark making, as if in conversation. As the child marks the paper, she moves closer and closer to the expanding blackness until she is in the midst of it. As if responding to the invitation to sink deeper into the soft, immersive markings, she removes her socks and shoes, lightly smudging the existing marks with her bare feet. In hospitality to this, the educator begins to trace a line around her foot. Being together with the charcoal calls for continued pedagogical attunement and responsiveness to the marks, the movement of bodies, to the drawings as they unfold, to the blackness as it devours the paper and invites our immersion in it. Each event takes shape as instances of proposing and activating possibilities, offering new shapes and configurations, a back and forth responsiveness, and a synergetic search for ways of entering into and enhancing children's material experimentations and art processes while taking care of the emergent possibilities. Manning describes relational movement as always improvisational. It requires attunement to the environment, to each other, to the charcoal, to what is taking shape. This is co-motion, a dance of attention, and choreography together. As Manning describes, choreography becomes a field for movement expression when the body becomes an intensive participant with the evolving milieu, rather than simply the instigator of the action. The expanding darkness has an absorbing and enveloping quality to it. It covers fingers, hands, feet, and paper. It is hospitable to touch, marking us as we create marks with us, drawing us deeper into its enveloping softness and encompassing darkness. Manning describes touch as a gesture of turning and reaching toward the other, a tenuous, ephemeral exposure of oneself to the other that might emerge in the encounter. Potentiality, that is who one might be or what things might become, is at the heart of this gesture. Touch invents, Manning writes, by drawing the other into relation. Charcoal is extended from child to educator in the meeting of fingers, in the touch of hands, in the rhythm of feet, in the closeness of bodies, and in the exchanges around the paper surfaces. What is being produced are particular kinds of relations and ways of being together, a rhythmic, synchronous, motional, relational, haptic, bodied, and responsive knowing. As Cristina proposed, an event of inventing new relational forms so that the studio, whether configured as a small children's studio space or a larger experimental space, becomes a site for new relationalities and ways of being, thinking, and creating together. Creating conditions and situations, organizing for emergence, not for children, but with, not for educators, but with. This shapes a view of making, whether art, pedagogies, curriculum, ways of being, studio spaces, and events, as always processual, and activates potentials in growing in artistry, becoming pedagogical, learning to attend and respond, and finding ourselves changed as we dwell in the midst of these multiple intersections and are implicated in the processual emergences. A making that attends to the qualities and relationalities of what is being produced and how we come into being in the company of others. Again, as O'Donoghue proposes, to focus on experience in art education is to seek out and pursue other alternatives for living with art and learning about self, other, and the world through art and its conditions. So as we join with the movements and materialities of making, there is an intraactive vibrancy of children, educators, atelierista, materials, and figurations. We become attentive to how things work, move, and interact together to produce particular experiences, artistic sensibilities, and to new ways of being and becoming. Together we are immersed in collective worlds in the making. We are in formation together. And what is being made or activated is not just individual inquiries and pursuits, or even teaching practices to imitate or apply, but a way of thinking, creating, and responding, producing even temporarily a dwelling space that is collectively made, that transforms and is transformed through the processes and practices set in motion by particular pedagogical and artistic orientations.
So, when thinking about the experiences that we have activated through these processes, it is important to highlight that we are cautious not to conceptualize them as means for an end, even when the end is the transformation of consciousness. Neither to consider them as experiences that are valuable for its own sake, which presents an idealization of the humanist idea of the arts for the art's sake. And this has been a concern that also other people in the academia share with us, that Gaston B. de Caterel, if I pronounce well the last name. Instead, we activate experiences that are interested in the makings of collective cultural and symbolic productions, both tangible and intangible. Such productions nurture an ethos through practices that enable processes that are context-specific. We understand an ethos not only as following a set of guiding values that characterizes a community, but also as a dwelling space that is collectively made, that transform and it is transformed through the processes and practices set in motion by particular pedagogical and artistic orientations. And we really hope that through our introduction to the different slides and photos and Sylvia's beautiful walking us through these images and ideas that she shared, you can see an ethos in the making, rather than something that is static, which sometimes gets connected or is an idea that with which we think about ethos. Thank you so much.
We have about 8 minutes remaining for questions. I was going to return to one that was asked around the 6:30 mark. I'll go ahead and begin with that. It was asked by Alyssa Blair. Can you speak to certain experiences or funds of knowledge early childhood educators or that you can work with through teacher preparation that help work toward the dispositions toward arts-based learning, experience, etc., that you're speaking of? I think generally the question is about teacher educators and what are some of the experiences and things that should be part of those programs that really enable them to begin thinking and practicing in the ways that you're discussing.
I mean, I have my ideas and Sylvia has hers, and I'm sure they're different.
Go ahead, Cristina.
But I think that none of the work that you saw today or anything that will come from the experience we have had at Capilano Children's Center could happen if we had followed the ideas that, for example, early childhood education should be about knowing child development, and that we need to do, developmentally appropriate practices. And I'm not saying or dismissing that these are not important, they are, but they can't be the discourse that generates work in early childhood education. It is just too reductive. That would be my first sort of point of departure on that question. Yeah, Sylvia.
Oh, there's so many ways I could answer that. To me, it's always this inventive process. I have never figured that one out yet. I'm still always in the process of figuring out. But I think also it's some of the experience to help students, in a sense, enter into this way of thinking. It might look beautiful. It is profoundly difficult. And so for me, it's also these experiences of how do we sort of warm up to this, not just jump into, you know, all of a sudden here's a beautiful charcoal room and now we're working with children. We work a lot, you know, with studio processes with students. So we might draw together, you know, find ourselves, put things into play where we have to respond to something more than ourselves. So sometimes that is taking clay to the river, or it's music while we're drawing with charcoal, where, you know, it's, so that we have to move with, like, putting things into play where we have to move with something beyond ourselves. To me, that is absolutely critical, that it's not just coming together where we each just put in a piece as if we're just adding, you know, putting together a jigsaw puzzle and we go away the same pieces as we started with. It's how do we intersect, move, and learn to do that with each other, so that when we can become more attuned to that with children, and then certainly with children are amazing at attuning us to the movements. They're always in movement. It's not so much anyways, there's a lot of ways I can answer that. I don't quite know how to answer that in a short period of time.
But perhaps one just little thing that will be important to say, Sylvia, is that you know, the pedagogists and artillerysts that could be a catalyst for rethinking and doing different things in early childhood education. But nothing will happen unless you have a faculty, like a group of early childhood instructors or professors that want to rethink what they are doing in early childhood education. Yeah. It's impossible without that.
Okay, I'm gonna pick one question from the Q&A box, if you guys don't mind. So there's a question about the making of pedagogical narrations as the mode of including, representing, sharing stories of art pedagogy intersections. So interactions in early childhood education. The involvement of pedagogical narrations as ways of possibly contributing to as curriculum making is ideation. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, sure.
I know that what Cristina and I will always have different, I mean, yeah. we do share a common heart, but we have different ways of approaching. For instance, to be fairly practical, in the charcoal events where we were working, I was working with a class of early childhood educators, students, educators in the center, and children. It was being very particular in what I was asking them to notice. It's not the linear evolution of things. It's noticing how is this working? What is happening? What is erupting? What is bursting out? Where are the rhythms? Asking for different ways of, you know, asking for particular things to be paying attention to, which frankly is very, very hard. It's in the doing of it, you develop sensitivities. There's no way we could say, this is what you have to do and then ask students to reproduce it. It's nurturing things so that in the documenting, you're developing sensitivities to what's going on. And then as it's shared and we look at each other's work and we begin to read it back and we read it in concert with perhaps Ingold's writing on making, and and different artists' work in terms of how artists work, it helps us attune to particular things. But I see this process of pedagogical narration or pedagogical documentation as this process of developing attunements, not of knowing and then reproducing. And we could also talk a long time about curriculum making and ideation and the role of documentation in that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I won't add anything because it's too big of a question.
We only have a few minutes left, but I did want to touch on, you brought up Ingold, and there was a question, a practical question that was somewhere in the Q&A. The question, I think it was from Mitzi, they were wondering which Tim Ingold text were you referring to? Was there a specific book that you were referencing, Sylvia?
Ingold is one of my favorite authors, so reference him a lot, but I use his book Making, Anthropology, Art, and Architecture quite a lot in courses, and particularly how he's describing making as this rhythmic correspondence with, and much more than just human intentionality. So I use those ideas quite a lot.
Thank you. It looks like we're running into the end of our time. Thank you, Sylvia, Cristina, thank you so very much for taking time to share your scholarship with us this evening, and for your generous responses to the questions of those who took time out of their evening to join us as well. For those of you who did join us this evening, thank you again for being with us. And stay tuned. There are more events coming up soon. So check the website and some of the social media, and we will continue to share details. And we will also be sure to share your questions in the Q&A that weren't asked with our distinguished presenters. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sylvia and Cristina.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Cristina.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm going to let this run just